There was a little girl who went to her mother and she said, where did humans come from? And her mother said, well, honey, God created Adam and Eve, and they had children, and then the whole world population came from that. She said, okay. So a couple of days later, she said, went to her father, and she said, asked him the same question, where did human beings come from? And he said, well, a long time ago, there were monkeys, and human beings evolved from monkeys. So she was confused. She thought, oh, well, what's the real truth? So she went back to her mother. She said, I don't understand. You told me one thing about humans, and my dad told me another thing. And she said, oh, honey, that's very simple. I was sharing with you about my side of the family. So this ongoing, question about creationism and evolution, and some people believe in the whole literal story of creation, and some people are in the middle, some people just believe in this whole idea of evolution. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. Not that I'm an expert, don't claim to be an expert, but we have a couple of groups who are now studying this book by Robert Brummett. Robert Brummett has been a long-time instructor at Unity Institute. He's written many books. This book is entitled Birthing a Greater Reality, A Guide for Conscious Evolution. And it has some interesting information in it. And one of the things he talks about in the book are what he calls trail markers in this study of evolution and how it all works. And he basically says that we can be conscious participants in our own evolution of consciousness. And he shares in the book many things. It's, as somebody said this morning, it's a very dense book, has a lot of information in it. But one of the things that stuck out for me was he talked about the omega point. And the omega point is, to my understanding, is a theory that was generated or posited by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is a French Jesuit priest and paleontologist, philosopher. And he proposed this idea about evolution, basically that God, the source, intelligence, light, power, all that is, all that we call God, involved itself into creation. That it's this idea of the Big Bang, and somehow the energy that is God, with all that energy and wisdom and intelligence and all of that, expressed itself as energy at some point, billions of years ago, and through evolution, that matter formed, and then more complex matter forms, and that intelligence begins to form, cellular structures, single cell structures, and then multiple cell structures, and eventually what we know as his human beings come into being. Through this process of ever evolving, ever expanding complex structures. And then eventually, because of the complex structures that are created by in the brain and the way that human beings evolve, that consciousness is born. Human consciousness is born. Really not all that long ago, according to the theories and other philosophers, maybe 200,000 years ago. And maybe 100,000 years ago that we became aware that we're aware. So we became Homo sapiens sapiens, right? The wise men. And so we became aware that we're aware. And that's where all the trouble started, right? Because we became self-reflective. We came to know ourselves and to sort of experience ourselves. And ever since, the evolution of consciousness has continued and continues to continue and evolve. And what Teilhard proposes is that at some point, that consciousness will evolve to the point at which humankind, knows itself as the divine. And that is what he termed the omega point. At some point, omega being the mind of God, that at some point that we will get there, right? And that may be billions of years down the road, but at some point. But what Brummett and many others say is that we can influence that. We can take steps consciously to evolve our own consciousness. And so, as I thought about that this week, that we don't have to separate. We don't have to say evolution is true or creationism is true. That they can work together, right? That even the Bible, as we understand the Bible, is a story from our understanding, as Charles and Myrtle Fillmore understood it, our co-founders understood it, is history and is a story about the evolution of consciousness. Beginning with Adam and Eve, the story of Adam and Eve. Even the story of Adam and Eve, when you look at it metaphorically and metaphysically, that whoever wrote that story, whoever compiled those stories, knew at some level that humanity grew out of a very simple life form, that God created human beings out of the dirt. That's what it says in that story. And so the human beings, as we know ourselves today, grew out of basic structure, cellular structure. And that Adam, coming into an awareness of himself, and Eve coming into an awareness of herself, and thinking themselves separate from God, cast themselves out of the garden by their own awakening to their self-reflection in a way, right? And so the Bible then, according to the Fillmores, charts the evolution of consciousness to Jesus. Jesus being one who achieved that awareness of his unity or oneness with God. Jesus being one who exampled that for us. And in the Gospel according to John, there are many things that Jesus is quoted as saying. In John 8:58, Jesus is quoted as saying, "Before Abraham was, I am." Acknowledging that oneness, that unity, that he knew himself as that. In John 10:30, he says, "The Father and I are one." In John 14:9, "Those who have seen me have seen the Father." In John 14:10, "Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but the Father who dwells in me does the work." So Jesus was teaching and speaking from the consciousness of unity, of oneness. And what we in Unity teach is that Jesus was not the great exception, but the great example. That we too can achieve that consciousness, a conscious unity with the divine, knowing ourselves as the divine. In fact, that is where we are going, where we are headed. And the Bible even concludes with this fabulous story in Revelation, the revelation to John, which is kind of scary sometimes when we read it and don't understand. But in our understanding and unity, it is a story of the evolution of consciousness. And it begins with the awareness of that Christ. In Revelation 21, 1 through 7, I'm sure many of you know this scripture. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people." So it is foretelling that time when we awaken to our unity, our knowing of God, and then when we know that, we know that we are not separate, and that divine life, that divine essence, the allness that God is, as we understand God, dwells within us, in our own consciousness, and we begin to embody that knowing. And the amazing thing about that is that when we know that, then we begin to act as if we know that. We know ourselves in unity as the divine, with the divine, and we also know ourselves in unity with each other, with all creation. And we know that what we do to one, we do to all, right? We awaken to that awareness. That I am one with you. You are one with me. I am one with the earth. I am one with the environment. I am one with all that exists in humanity, in creation. And so that's where we're going. And that, as Mr. Brummett says in the book, that is our salvation as humanity. That we must get there, basically, or we will end up destroying ourselves. Just destroying each other and destroying the world. And so that is our ultimate salvation. And so it's possible, right? It's possible for us as we teach that we can do that we can come into that awareness. And as I thought about that, I was thinking about the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John, as we understand it in unity, as we teach it, is the gospel of the cosmic Christ, or the gospel of the universal Christ. That as we understand it, that Christ is not Jesus' last name. That the Christ is a universal idea. And so, why is that? Why am I talking about that? Why do I think that's important in this whole scheme of things? And I think it's important because I just want to throw this out to you today because it came to me as I was meditating and writing about what I wanted to talk about today. That I've always understood in unity that the Christ is a divine idea in the mind of God. Divine idea in the mind of the all for humanity. And it clicked with me this week that all creation began as an idea in that one mind. That Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, says that God, now stay with me here a little bit, that God, as we understand God, did not create the world. But God, as we understand God, ideated the world. Does that make sense? That everything was an idea, began as an idea in the mind of God. And to me, that connects this idea of divine design and intelligent design with the idea of evolution. That everything that we see in form began as an idea in the mind of the divine. And that idea for you and me is what we call the Christ. And that idea born in you and me as we awaken to it is constantly drawing us back into relationship with God, with the Creator. That is indwelling. It is a part of who we are. And that it is constantly and consistently guiding us, drawing us into a more conscious awareness of our source, of where it all began. And that the divine idea for humanity as the Christ evolves in us. That God involved itself as you and me as what we know as the Christ principle. And that Christ principle continues to evolve in us, drawing us ever closer to our awareness of our unity in the divine. Now, why is that important? Because what I believe about the Christ idea is that the Christ idea for you and me is imbued with the energy of love. Y'all still with me? The Christ idea is imbued with the highest energy of God, which we understand as love. And so as we draw closer into, as that Christ is drawing us closer into an awareness of who we are, we become more aware of the energy that love is through us. As Charles Fillmore said, love is that attracting, harmonizing, connecting power of God. Charles Fillmore said this about love, if I can find it here. The metaphysical meaning of love, the pure essence of being that binds together the whole human family. In divine mind, love is the power that joins and binds in divine harmony the universe and everything in it. The greatest harmonizing principle known to man. So as we awaken to the Christ of us, we also awaken to love. And that love, the love that Christ is, the Christ in us, that is encoded with this vibration of love. And stay with me for a minute here. Again, this is something that came to me this week. I'm sharing it with you, and I'm really inviting contemplation of it for myself and for you, that this energy of love is the power of the Christ within us that is always attracting into our lives everything we need to know ourselves as the Christ. Make sense? So that attracting power of love is always attracting into our lives everything that we need from our human perspective to be drawn higher into our understanding. And to me, that is the definition of grace. You and I live in a field, a consciousness of grace. Because love is the greatest power, and that love in us, through us, as us, is always active in this field that is drawing us to whatever we need personally to know our divine self. Now, that doesn't mean that we always acknowledge it, does it? It doesn't mean that we don't judge it as bad. But imagine approaching life. Imagine that you are actively involved in evolving your own consciousness. Imagine if this was your way of living in the world, that everything that happens for me. Everything that happens in my life happens for me. For me to come into a greater awareness, a greater understanding of my divine self, the Christ that I am. How would our lives be different? Even the things that show up in our lives that we think are awful, illness, loss, if we look at them and say, how can this help me to know who I truly am, to awaken more fully to my Christ self, and to evolve my consciousness so I am rising in awareness of my unity with God? Can you imagine how different life would seem? Can anybody say we're willing to do that? To really approach life from that perspective? I think that is what we are, in one way, just one way, that we can be conscious participants in our own evolution of consciousness. Because that is where our power lies. It's choosing how we are going to perceive ourselves and the world around us. We get to choose our thoughts, how we think, how we judge, how we perceive. That is our power. And if we approach life from the perspective that everything that happens is for me, imagine how empowering that would be for us. Everything happens so that I can awaken more fully to my true self. And not only that, but everything happens so that I can be a greater expression of my true self. I think I'm not an avid student of A Course in Miracles, but I seem to remember something it says about that everything is either an expression of love or a call for love. Something like that. And so if we see everything as that, how would our life be different? Everything is either a call for love, for us to express love, or everything is an expression of love. Love awakening us to the love that we are. Love reflecting to us the Christ that we are. Love awakening. So it says in 1 John, those who know God love, but those who do not love don't really know God. So I think it is awakening to the idea of Christ, which is infused, encoded, embedded with this energy of love. And as we awaken to that, we awaken it in our minds, and we become that expression of divine love in the world. And again, that's one way, only one way, that we can engage ourselves consciously in our own evolutionary process. Because it is that Christ within us, the divine idea that you are in the mind of God, that is the evolutionary impulse within you, calling you to a higher knowing,